Thank you so much, Catherine, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Helmut, for the kind invitation and the opportunity to present my work here. And I'm glad to see that this lunchtime colloquium is actually a place where people are having lunch, so I'm not keeping you from your lunch. Enjoy. As Catherine said, the topic that I'll speak about today is derived from my second book project, my Habitations project, on the history of agricultural research stations in various European empires, specifically the German Empire, the Dutch Empire, and the British Empire, and their interconnections. In the second book, I'll try to show how these agricultural research stations of various European empires were entangled with one another, as well as with colonial administration and the plantation economy on site. What I'm talking about today is only just a small aspect of that, a broader project, and that aspect concerns pest control in various European empires, specifically the German agricultural research stations. What I'm presenting today, I've published in an article, I've written in an article that's soon coming out in History of Intellectual Culture, and I'm happy to receive your input and comments for the reviews that are still coming. So the core assumption behind the second book project, also behind the article, is that colonialism and science went hand in hand. Examples of this are the numerous research institutes and education tracks in various imperializing European nation states and international scientific conferences, which were directed at understanding and steering the colonial project based on scientific principles. While this scientization of colonialism is studied fairly well, there is an aspect in it that is less studied so far, and that's the role of medical discourses around plant diseases or phytopathology. In the next roughly 25 minutes, I'll first zoom in a bit more on this science of plant diseases that I studied in the article. I'll lay out my argument, present the sources and the methods I used, and then focus on the two main objectives that plant pathologists, so scientists that studied plant health and their diseases, pursued in the colonies. One, supporting the colonial plantation economy, and two, spreading European norms through the so-called cultural mission. So, for starters, what is phytopathology? Phytopathology is the study of plant diseases, their origins, their prevention, and their cures. The history of this discipline serves as an example of a scientific endeavor that connected different areas of knowledge in various functional domains. Phytopathology around 1900 served as a meeting point for individuals from academia, agriculture, and the foodstuff industry. What's more, research into plant health and diseases blended together approaches from botany, zoology, mycology, entomology, meteorology, and the agricultural sciences. So to understand plant health and their diseases, you had to know about plants, animals, fungi, insects, the weather, agricultural techniques, so pretty encompassing. Let me quickly outline the concrete shape of phytopathological endeavors in the colonies by explaining the contemporary sites, actors, and methods of this discipline. The place or the site for phytopathological research were agricultural research stations. With the onset of formal German colonialism after the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, the Reich began to establish agricultural research stations in the colonies. And I'd like to show you the two most important ones of these. That's Victoria in the German Cameroons and Amani in German East Africa. Founded around 1889, Victoria in Cameroon was the first German colonial experimental garden. As a publicly financed institution, the Victoria Experimental Garden was intended to increase the yields of surrounding privately run plantations through novel methods of crop science. So the studies of the station fed directly into the local colonial economy. A little more than a decade after the Victoria Experimental Garden in 1902, the Imani Biological and Agricultural Institute was established in the Usambara Mountains in German East Africa. Stations like Victoria and Amani were central meeting spots that enabled scientists and practitioners to produce phytopathological knowledge and to also disseminate it through the station's respective publication organs. In the article and also in the talk today, I focus on two exemplary actors, Walter Busse and Julius Vosseler, who were chiefly involved in phytopathological studies in the German African colonies, specifically German East Africa, Togo, and Cameroon. These are two perspectives that allow for a multi-sided and longer-term view on the development of phytopathological discourses and practices in tropical agriculture. While Busse, the first actor, conducted 2 expeditions to Togo and the Cameroons, Vosseler was permanently based at the Imani Institute in German East Africa. Busse had a background in pharmacy and botany, while Vosseler had studied zoology. Busse, after having conducted several phytopathological expeditions to West Africa, accepted a post in the Imperial Colonial Office. So he was more of an administrator, interested in advancing colonial policies. Vosseler, in contrast, never held any administrative position and considered himself a scientist, pure and simple. Studying 2 actors who were rooted in different institutional settings shows that both the economic objectives and the so-called cultural mission of phytopathology could be pursued in different ways, but rested on the same experimental mindset. That brings me to the third aspect in characterizing phytopathology around 1900, the method. In terms of method, phytopathological research most closely followed the trends of the agricultural sciences. Just like other field sciences around 1900, the study of plant health can only be understood when acknowledging the experimental mindset of its actors. Phytopathologists did not need full-fledged laboratories to conduct experiments. So what we see here is a typically staged photograph that was taken in the laboratory of the Agricultural Research Station Buitenzorg in the Dutch East Indies. And that's, that was meant to depict colonial hierarchies and did not necessarily reflect the everyday work in an agricultural research station, which was much more hands-on. Because the method scientists and practitioners alike attached epistemological validity to at that time was the field trial, resting on trial and error and frequent repetition. As Frank Uekötter has demonstrated, while agricultural scientists around 1900 did conduct chemical experiments in the laboratory to assess soil quality or determine formulas for plant nutrients, they never dismissed the field trial as a valuable source of insight, irrespective of reported mistakes, inexact measures, or irreproducibility inherent in this practical approach. My claim is that this hands-on method of the field trial that tied scientific knowledge production at agricultural research stations to concerns of planters on the ground. I'm sorry. My claim is that it's this hands-on method of the field trial that tied scientific knowledge production to practical concerns of planters on the ground, that it is this same experimental mindset that went beyond mere agricultural questions too. The attempt to control one's surrounding by inducing stimuli and testing for their effects shaped both the scientific approach of phytopathology and their colonial policy agenda. That means that plant pathologists consulted planters and indigenous farmers about growing, nurturing, and protecting plants with a dual objective: valorizing the occupied land and imparting their notions of hygiene upon the colonized population. A few words about the sources that I used. For the paper, I analyzed travel reports, periodicals, and archival material stored in the Prussian Secret State Archives, the German Entomological Institute near Berlin, and the Berlin State Library. My objective was to both scrutinize colonial discourses and embed them in their materiality, following Roque and Wagner, who elucidate the intricate nature of colonial knowledge. As said, the materiality of phytopathological knowledge included both the research station and the field. The hybrid mode of knowledge production in the lab and in the field can be grasped thanks to critical laboratory studies. Classical works by Kari Knott-Cetina, Bruno Latour, and Steve Wolga have shown that laboratory research methods and their societal contexts were not separate but deeply intertwined. More recently, historians of the life sciences like Robert Kohler have joined in tearing down the alleged wall between lab and field sciences. For the remaining part of my talk, I will focus on the two objectives by colonial phytopathology: one, supporting the plantation economy, and two, quote-unquote, educating the colonized population, so the cultural mission. First objective: to a large extent, the phytopathological publications focused on economic prospects of cash crop production. The economic lens guiding phytopathological inquiries shows in the problem definitions presented in the sources. In a report about his expeditions to Cameroon and Togo from 1905, Walter Busse elaborated on what he considered the two main plagues in the region: the cocoa blight and the bark bug, which you can see on the slide. The blight was caused by various fungi that nested in the cocoa fruit, rendering the fruits light brown at first and yellow whitish at a later stage. The bark bug, in turn, attacked young cocoa tree branches and extracted their juices. Both pests affecting cocoa trees, the pests weakened one of the central cash crops in the region. In Busse's efforts to combat blight and the bark bug, experiments played a critical role at various points. Field trials were carried out to identify possible causes and solutions, as planters could only report specific symptoms displayed by the plants, but could not report about the causes. In many cases, the exact causes of the symptoms was not immediately obvious. To pinpoint the causes of diseases, Busse employed various methods, with one of the primary approaches being inoculations. During inoculations, potential disease triggers were introduced into healthy plants to observe any resulting symptoms. In Busse's investigation of the blight, he injected one kind of fungus, Phytophthora, into 20 cocoa fruits, and another kind of fungus, Coletotrichum incarnatum, into 3 other cocoa fruits. In the first group, 9 fruits quickly exhibited the typical blight symptoms. In the second group, only 1 fruit showed signs of infection. But this demonstrated still that also the other fungus, Coletotrichum, constituted a potential threat to the cocoa tree. Besides identifying causes for plant diseases, for instance, through inoculations, Busse experimented for finding possible solutions. In the course of fighting the bark bug, planters tried various measures with different levels of success, and Busse weighed in on their attempts in periodical articles. He reported in detail about most attempts and showed what did and did not work. For his own trials conducted during his stay in the German Cameroons, he turned towards a remedy developed at the Molive plantations, a mixture of Schweinfuttergrün, petroleum, soap, soda, and water, and on top of that recommended to use a pure suspension Schweinfuttergrün in water with an addition of carpenter's glue to reduce wash-off. So what we see here is that Busse's experiments were supported by and were fed back into the practical experiences colonial planters gathered on the ground. So planters' experiential knowledge was beneficial to the phytopathological inquiry, and in turn, phytopathological research improved farming techniques. Coming to the second objective of plant pathologists, the cultural mission. should be noted that the context of tropical agriculture provided another subtext to the way plant diseases were studied and remedied, besides economic objectives. And that is the objective of, quote-unquote, educating and, quote-unquote, elevating the colonized population. The literature has shown how colonizers put forth the so-called civilizing mission as a rationale for their own doing. The cases of Busse and Vosseler show that also the agricultural sphere was an area where the indigenous population could be, quote-unquote, educated and their lives could, quote-unquote, be improved. European colonists sought to introduce their agricultural practices to the colonized regions, aiming to increase the crop yield, but equally importantly, to adjust indigenous habits according to their categories of understanding. As an example, Busse's expedition reports contained lengthy remarks on the local population at the beginning and the end of his texts, framing his arguments through a cultural narrative. His stance in this differed from white planters based in Togo and Cameroon, who were quite vocal about their violent attitude towards the indigenous population and who advocated for the use of force in disciplining the local workforce. Busse deviated from this openly dehumanizing discourse in that he called for, quote-unquote, educating natives in the agricultural techniques of the white man. According to him, the colonized needed to be introduced to proper agricultural methods for hygienic reasons. In this, Busse echoed part of the planter's stance by calling out indigenous plantations that to him seemed to be in a dire state to the point of seeming abandoned. Since he identified air circulation as a driver for spreading fungi, plantations that were not tended according to the proper way seemed like a potential here for further infections and a threat to the plantation economy. This relates to the contemporary discourse of tropical hygiene, prominent in tropical medicine. Sarah Ehlers has written about that in 2022. Although Busse highlighted that many European plantations were in an equally regrettable state because their owners did not fight upcoming infections, he did not direct any lengthy call for actions at the Europeans, only at the indigenous populations. However, while Busse argued for the generally flawed disposition of African farmers, he conceded that, quote, not all of these farms deserve a derogatory judgment, quote unquote. According to him, a farm run by an African man named Beecroft, close to the plantation of the West African Plantation Society Victoria, showed exceptional results. The best managed, that's the quote that you can see on the slide, the best managed of the farms I visited was that of Beecroft. This farm testifies to the extraordinary intelligence and agricultural talent of its owner. It is quite a valuable property, and as far as the infestation by the bark bug is concerned, it does not differ in any way from the equally infested plots of some European plantations, where control attempts have not been made or have been insufficient. So we see a classical paternalistic stance of the cultural mission here, in that Busse highlights the so-called potential of the African population to learn and possibly become what he considered civilized. The second actor, Julius Vosseler, deviated from Busse's stance in this regard. While Busse emphasized the African agriculturalists' potential to learn and adopted the paternalistic approach of educating them, Vosseler's writings speak of a racist and derogatory perspective of the cultural mission. In his account, not only indigenous agricultural techniques seemed unhygienic, but the colonized population itself appeared as a pest. Specifically, this referred to reports planters had given about an increase of coconut theft on the island Mafia, just outside the east coast of German East Africa. Discussing the problem of theft in his writing, Vosseler conceptualized thieves as a form of pest which hurt the plantation economy. It should be noted here, and we can take that up in the discussion too, that half the population of the island Mafia at that time was held as slaves and lived in dire conditions. Earlier, we have seen that Walter Busse, the first actor, had laid out possibilities to combat vermin and pests through chemical means in great detail. In the same way and with the same experimental mindset, Fossila, the second actor, went to great length to elaborate on means to keep the black population away from the cash crop. And it is portraying the colonized population as a pest itself. This is just one long paragraph from an article I want to show you here, from an article series that Fossila published about mammals as pests, so also monkeys, elephants. And in this paragraph, he recommends to farmers how to fight off black individuals from the cash crop. I'm just reading this out for you. Perhaps the mentioned method of setting traps may be deterrent enough. However, it should not be forgotten that the thieves soon learned to use long sticks to close the traps in front of them and render them harmless. Moreover, the suggested idea of covering tree trunks with sharp metal spikes and thorns would not provide absolute defense, would cost a lot of money, and make harvesting more difficult. Nighttime guards are also of little help. They often perform their duties inadequately without proper control. Fences made of barbed wire or living thorn hedges may perhaps serve their purpose best despite significant initial costs, especially for smaller plantations if they are consistently maintained. So what might jump at you first is the racist stereotypes typical for the time around 1900, but the source also reveals that the experimental approach of phytopathologists extended beyond tinkering with plants and their health. Just like Fossila in his other writings scrutinized how to combat plant diseases, he mused about ways to keep the insurgent indigenous population at bay in this piece of writing, hence echoing colonial policies and enacting the colonial project in a nutshell. Summing up my main points, pest control in the German colonies was meant to fulfill a dual objective. On the one hand, the valorization of lands and plants. On the other, pursuing the cultural mission of, quote-unquote, elevating the indigenous population. So the agricultural research station as an experimental setting drew its purpose directly from impacting its immediate surrounding, the plantation economy in its racialized environments. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.